Hi everyone, welcome to the Internationalist. This is the third episode of our new season, running every Friday at 7 p.m. CEST, hosted by David and me. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. I'm here in London in the United Kingdom. It's an incredibly grey day outside, but at least it's Friday. I'm looking forward to a weekend of staying in bed and not doing very much. How are you, Varsha?
I'm good. I'm back in Hyderabad, my home city. We had a good week, surprisingly, last week with a huge nationwide shutdown led by the farmers' protest. Our Prime Minister Modi went to the UN, was greeted by protesters in the US with calls of him being India's Hitler, which of course led to a counter-response by the right wing here. They circulated a fake New York Times front page saying Modi was the hope of the world, which led to the New York Times responding in a pretty tragically comic way, saying this wasn't us, it was actually fake. But all in all, interesting things happening in
Nothing
India.
beats Indian WhatsApp. I will give you that.
It's true. And of course, I can't not talk about vaccines. I have two pieces of hopeful news from the world. There were a dozen doctors from Harvard protesting outside of Moderna's CEO's home in Beacon Hill, I believe, in Boston, with a pile of human bones, a huge protest asking him to share the technology of Moderna. But as many of our readers might have seen from our briefing earlier today, Brazil is also all set to pass a radical new law that would break patents, that would break, big pharma monopoly and ensure compulsory licensing. That'll help vaccinations, not just in Brazil, but really all over the world. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how both of these efforts might get us a step closer to vaccine internationalism.
Rays of hope.
Okay, so back to the Internationalist. Our first episode was Internationalism Against the Machine with the fantastic Tom Morello. And last week, as you might have seen, was Internationalizing the Intifada with Yara Hawari from Palestine. Both are now available on our YouTube channel. And that's my cue to remind all of you who are watching us today to please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already done so. And this week, we're discussing sanctions. David, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's in store for
Sure.
today?
So today's episode is focusing on this invisible weapon of war known as economic sanctions. This is a weapon that has been sold to publics around the world, to democratic publics around the world, as being innocent, as being clever, honest, and above all, being victimless. But which inflicts tremendous pain and suffering on civilian populations around the world. So as we'll see from today's show, in the specific case that it raises, sanctions, or what might be known by their UN name more formally, coercive unilateral measures, have both direct and indirect impacts on civilian populations. Again, those same populations that our governments often tell us they're striving to protect, to represent, by designing these measures that target foreign countries. So, in a word, today's episode's title is Sanctions Kill. Welcome to the Internationalist.
Perhaps the most high-profile use of sanctions is the US's 60-year-long blockade against Cuba, designed to squeeze the island economically and create such discontent that the communist regime is toppled. The trade restrictions mean, Cuban hospitals face difficulty acquiring medicine, sourcing food is far more expensive than it needs to be. And 3 years ago, as a lot of our readers might remember, the UN estimated the blockade had cost Cuba something like $130 billion. And last year, as the pandemic struck, calls to end sanctions rang out in the halls of the UN, in the WTO, but yet the crippling embargo has remained. This isn't a story just about Cuba. In Iran, for instance, where the Trump administration reimposed sanctions in 2019, the story of their impact is markedly similar. In 2019, the Iranian currency lost 50% of its value against the dollar, and massive inflation has meant that food and drink prices were up 61% on year. Meat products were up, I think, something like 116%. So wherever we look, wherever it might be in the world, the barbarism of sanctions is absolutely clear. And so today, as David and I discuss the broader impact of sanctions, we'll be focused on one story, which began all the way back in 2017. Nearly $2 billion have been illegally blocked for 4 years by the Portuguese bank Novo Banco and prevented from reaching Venezuelan government bank accounts, where President Maduro intended to use the money to invest in essentials for his people. In 2019, President Maduro asked the Portuguese government to issue a statement. The Novo Banco has kidnapped $1,726 million, which were meant to purchase medicines, food, and supplies, he said during a press conference that he gave earlier that year. Release our medicine, Portugal. We need health supplies. These were the cries heard from protesters as they rallied outside the Portuguese embassy in Caracas. So today, while the crippling impact of sanctions on Venezuela remains, 4 years after this money was initially blocked, it's still in the hands of Novo Banco in Portugal.
Earlier this week, Clare, Daly and Mick, Wallace, two members of European Parliament for Independence for Change from Ireland, wrote a letter along with parliamentarians from across Europe, senators, members of Irish Parliament, wrote to CEO Antonio Ramalho to urge the transfer of a small portion of that $1.7 billion directly to the Pan American Health Organization. This is not money that could be used in any way for political purposes. There's no risk of this being, transferred into the hands of government officials or their friends. This is money that was already ring-fenced by the Pan American Health Organization for roughly 13 million vaccines, polio, diphtheria, yellow fever, as well as around 30 million syringes that are necessary to transplant those vaccines. So in this letter that they wrote to Ramalho, there's over 75 signatories on this letter, which was released yesterday by the Progressive International. They write, at this point in time, there is no legal or extra-legal obstacle that would preclude a Portuguese bank from making a small transfer of this money in Brazilian reais. So it's not even going to touch the US dollar system where so much of the US sanction process takes place, directly to a Brazilian account to pay for humanitarian supplies for children. So we're trying to raise awareness of this case, trying to put a pressure on Novo Banco to respond, not by necessarily releasing that $1.7 billion. We understand that that's probably untouchable at this stage, but just the $12 million that has been specifically ring-fenced to the Pan American Health Organization.
If you like the show today, please subscribe to the Progressive International YouTube channel. It'll take you 2 seconds. Turn on the notifications so you know when our next episode is out and any other content that we publish on this channel. As you already know, Progressive International is funded exclusively by small donations from people like you, from supporters from around the world. We don't receive any public grants, any government money, and so we're entirely dependent on support from you. If you like our shows and believe in our political project, please go to progressive.international/support, donate, and help us build it together.
So today, it's our pleasure to welcome Mick, to welcome Clare to the show. I sat down with them and had an interview about why they wrote the letter, what are the contents of the letter, and why they think it's so important at this stage in time to be raising the profile of this letter to a global audience, to change our understanding of what sanctions are, how they work, and whose ultimate impact is suffered most. So here is my interview with Mick and Clare from Brussels, two wonderful MEPs from Ireland. Thank you. I'm joined today by two very special guests, two members of Parliament, two members of Independence for Change, two members of the left in European Parliament, Mick, Wallace, and Clare, Daly. Very welcome to both of you to The Internationalist.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
So I'm hoping you can summarize briefly. This show is going out on Friday, and I'm hoping you can summarize briefly what is the letter that you two have been working on, and what is the political context, the political purpose, and the political project that is kind of contained by this intervention around the case of Novo Banco and the frozen assets it has there.
Well, I suppose, I think people are pretty much aware of the fact that Venezuela has been very harshly treated by the international community for a long period, mostly at the behest of the US and the complicity of the EU. So all the nations that perceive themselves to be either allies of the US or those who are scared of challenging US sanctions a lot of them have refused to respect the legitimacy of the Maduro government. So obviously there's money frozen in banks around the world belong to the Venezuelan government that the Venezuelans badly need. They're in a difficult place. They've a lot of problems, and one of them, obviously, the decline in the price of oil has had a dramatic impact on how Venezuela operates. Their own failure probably to establish more independence from oil revenue. falls on their plate as well. But obviously, the US sanctions have been pretty dramatic and draconian, illegal, and totally in breach of international law. And so, this particular letter that we're writing is just focusing on a small amount of the money in one of those banks, and that bank is Novo Banco in Portugal. And the effort is a humanitarian effort to have money released for the benefit of children in Venezuela, and it's obviously linked up with medicine in relation to COVID, right? So it's a humanitarian effort, and also it's an effort to challenge the Portuguese to respect international law. Now, the 2 billion in funds that Novo Banco are withholding are technically unfrozen at the moment. The Portuguese government recognizes the Maduro government in Venezuela. The US unilateral coercive measures against the government of Venezuela don't apply to the EU or to Portugal. And the Portuguese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has confirmed this specifically in a verbal note to the Venezuelan embassy in Lisbon. Now, even in this particular case, the funds will not go near Venezuela. They'll go directly to a Brazil-based Pan-American health organization to pay for much-needed vaccines and medicines for children in Venezuela. And the point is, there's nothing in international law that would support a decision by Novo Banco to refuse to let go of these funds. If they do, they're nothing more than criminals, and they share responsibility with the US administration for the deaths of many, many people in Venezuela, and they should face justice for their crimes in this respect. I mean, it just isn't good enough. They're hiding behind law that doesn't exist. They're hiding behind excuses that don't stand up anymore, and it just isn't good enough.
Yeah, I mean, we think it's really important. Like, we've been to Venezuela twice, once last year when we were members of the European Parliament, but also when we were members of the Irish Parliament, and we've seen firsthand the impact on the living standards of the Venezuelan people who are suffering really badly under the sanctions. And like, we commissioned a report here ourselves about the legality, or rather the illegality, of sanctions, the idea being that sanctions now are proving more deadly than guns. So this initiative around this letter really is to focus. It's a bit of a test case, we kind of see it. I mean, the European Union is never short of pontificating about how great they are in democracy and rule of law and human rights and all the rest of it. They totally make you sick. And here you have a situation where a European bank is basically robbing Venezuela. Like, they are responsible for the theft of Venezuelan resources, which they're keeping, and not allowing the Venezuelan government to use that money. So we focused really narrowly on the release of a small amount of the funds for purely medicine and vaccines for children. And my God, like, if a Portuguese bank can't do that, it's a shocking indictment of so-called European democracy.
One of the things that I think is so powerful about the letter, as you mentioned, is that it's really focused on highlighting this logic that sanctions kill. You know, you can have whatever opinion you want to have about governments in X country or Y country. You can think that the money belongs in this bank or that bank account. You can take whatever position you want in that geopolitical conflict. But the narrow fact remains that this money is clearly ring-fenced for, as you mentioned, Mick, polio vaccines, diphtheria treatments, yellow fever vaccines, a long list of syringes that are desperately needed by the people of this country. And yet this Portuguese bank, which I hasten to add, is owned 75%, a mega majority is owned by a private equity firm based in the United States called Lone Star, which is, obviously creating these profound links. It's not just a case of Portugal and Portugal alone. There are already these kind of transnational links which ensnare the case in U.S. sanctions. These ways in which sanctions kind of, even if the bank is preempting the sanctions, they haven't been directed necessarily to do something, it can create this huge humanitarian impact on the other side. And so, Clare, I wanted to ask, even in the case where this is so clear cut, where it's so clearly humanitarian, where it's so clear that the needs of in this case, a private bank are superseding those of children in need of polio vaccine,
what are the challenges of organizing around this kind of issue from inside European Parliament, from inside Brussels? How easy was it to find signatures for this letter? And if it was difficult, what do you think are the chief obstacles to building a coalition around respect for international law?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the points we would regularly find in the European Parliament is that the EU is pretty Atlanticist in its outlook. They tend to bend the knee to US policy rather than doing what they should be doing, is developing an independent foreign policy. So we find across the political groups, generally people are pretty disappointing in insisting that international law would be upheld and that their humanitarian responsibilities would be fulfilled. So with this letter, we got, I mean, I don't know, Mick, what was the final count on it? Because we did the initiative both in the European Parliament and in the Irish Parliament.
Yeah, we ended up getting, there's 24 MEPs, members of the European Parliament, after signing the letter in total. And we actually have, we've 53 from the Irish Parliament, which is a great number from the Irish Parliament. And then Justin Podor and Medea Benjamin also signed it. So we've actually 79 in total, which, you know, look at, as Clare was saying, the European Parliament is a very conservative right-wing institution. We would say that over 90% of the Parliament are right-wing, are Atlanticist in their thinking, and they are afraid to challenge American interests. And the fear of challenging America because of the possible financial implications is a huge factor. America does control world finance to a great degree because of the supremacy of the dollar. It probably won't last forever. I don't see the Chinese putting up with it forever anyway. And it's a big problem. And right now, the Americans have sanctions against, at last count, there was 39 countries. And they use it as a weapon to bring about regime change. And unfortunately, too many people in the European Parliament don't have the courage or the will to go to that space to actually speak the truth about what's really happening. Now, a lot of them were very embarrassed about Afghanistan because what the sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan exposed, it didn't just expose the 20-year lie that the Afghanistan war was, but see, it also exposed NATO, and it also exposed the EU member states for what was really going on. And I mean, for Biden to come out and say, well, we were never into nation building there anyway, when the Europeans were boasting for the last 20 years that it wasn't a nation building project, which was obviously a load of nonsense. But they were really exposed by it. But the members in the European Parliament have still not got to a place where they will stand up to the aggressive behavior, the bullying behavior of the Americans, particularly in their use of sanctions.
And can I, on that, David, I mean, I think the point Mick makes about the huge disconnect between the citizens of Europe and the European establishment on foreign affairs is replicated in everything. That disconnect exists across all levels of society. And when they speak, they wonder then why hardly anybody votes in European elections, because a lot of people are completely demoralized with the way in which the European Union is run, how neoliberal ideas are supreme. And, you know, they, in that context, then the members of the European Parliament have managed to kind of protect themselves from reality. And they're disconnected from reality in the bubble that exists here. One of the influences that we see a lot in terms of Venezuela is the father of Leopoldo Lopez is a member of the European Parliament. So that right wing, you know, unrepresentative, rich minority from Venezuela are unduly influencing the thinking. And also they've managed to create this myth that sanctions don't hurt, this idea that sanctions are, oh, they're somehow harmless and they're only targeted at certain people and all of this, and they've kind of protected themselves from that. So when anything is raised about Venezuela, Leopoldo Lopez's father, who I think is also called Leopoldo Lopez, would send in, all his big lies about Maduro and all this kind of stuff, and that has a certain amount of influence.
And there's strong evidence. I mean, some of them, there's obviously money frozen as well in US institutions. And the Americans have actually released some of that money to Lopez and Guaido. Yeah. Guaido and Lopez have robbed more money from Venezuela than we're asking for it to be released from Banco Novo. They rob more. They're stealing money that belongs to the people of Venezuela, and they're being facilitated by the US with the complicity of the EU, who have refused to criticize and condemn what's happening.
So this crisis of democracy in the sphere of foreign policy is very recognizable to me as a citizen of the United States. We have some domains of policy that are very exposed, they're very politicized. They're certainly not democratic in a strong D sense, but they are more democratic in the sense that people can have a vibrant conversation around them, and legislators are expected to respond to those kinds of demands, even partially. Whereas in foreign policy, we call it the blob of foreign policy, where there's an establishment that is difficult to talk to, that's where there's a strong cross-partisan convergence, where there's very little room for democratic negotiation, deliberation on some of these questions, because you end up with policies like the Cuban embargo from the United States, which is deeply unpopular. We ran some polling, we, the Progressive International, along with Data for Progress, a polling firm where I'm a fellow, around US opinions towards sanctions and the Cuban embargo. We found huge mega majorities, something like 59 to 29 in favor of ending the embargo and ending sanctions, especially insofar as they relate to these humanitarian issues, the COVID-19 pandemic and similar. But I'm very curious to the extent that you were able to gather so many signatures from Ireland in particular. Now, I know that Brussels is a blob in itself. It's a fortified legislating, city with high walls and high barriers to entry into these institutions. I wonder, is Dublin any different? How should we make sense of the questions of strategic autonomy, democratic foreign policy making from Ireland in particular?
Well, look, generally speaking, Ireland follows the US agenda. We're still allowing an airport in Ireland called Shannon to be used as a US military base, where the Americans can go on to destroy communities in countries with predominantly Muslim populations. So we actually are also complicit in the US destruction of communities in West Asia and other parts. But you ask, why did we manage to gather so many signatures? Well, Ireland, while the Irish government and the signatures didn't come from people that are in strong positions in government or anything, right? They came mostly from the opposition. It's important to remember, if you look at the position that Irish politicians tend to take on Palestine, for example, we're actually not the worst. We're one of the better ones in Europe, right? And even our foreign minister, who is right-wing neoliberal, he actually came out and condemned the last Israeli assault on Palestine. And he was pretty strong about it, right? And the Israelis were really angry with Ireland for doing it, right? So, and the Irish in general, the Irish people are pretty, we were an underdog for a long time. We were occupied by the British for 800 years, right? And not many countries with predominantly white-skinned people were occupied for so long by an empire like the British. And we know what it's like to be downtrodden, and people haven't forgotten. It's 100 years since we got our so-called independence, even though that's a debate for another as to how much independence we really have, because we seem to have taken on a new master in the form of the US and got rid of the Brits. But the Irish do have a graw or a likeness for the underdog. And we're not totally stupid, and we can see that there isn't a level playing field in Palestine. And while the president of the European Union, von der Leyen, was able to condemn the rockets that came from Gaza that killed 2 children in Israel, but couldn't condemn the Israeli bombardment that killed over 60 children. Now, I mean, come on, the lack of balance was scary. And but in fairness, the Irish government were pretty good on the Palestine thing, but the Irish people in general have always had an affinity with the Palestinians. It's so blatantly obvious to us that this is so unfair that we've actually been pretty good on the issue. And there was even legislation passed in relation to the BDS movement in Ireland, but obviously still to come into force. But there's strong support for the BDS movement in Ireland. So for us to garner 53 signatures out of a parliament of about 160 members and the Senate of another 60 wasn't so surprising for us.
I think, we're at least nominally neutral as well, and our stance of neutrality is one that's very popular with the people. And I was struck by your remarks, David, about the disconnect between American citizens and American foreign policy. And we would have the same in Ireland. Like, the Irish people are very fond of our neutrality. And I would say as well, the European people are also disconnected from the foreign policy of the EU. Like, we have constant battles here about massive anti-Chinese rhetoric, massive anti-Russian propaganda, which survey after survey shows the people of Europe don't share that. They want to see a diplomatic resolution of disputes rather than an escalation of militarism and securitization. But foreign policy is being dictated by the military-industrial complex now everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty shocking for most people in Europe that the European Union were so much more exercised about a fellow called Navalny being put in prison than they were about over 60 children being killed by Israeli terrorism.
I think that part of the disconnect. This is maybe a bit too optimistic, because I think that, Clare, you're definitely right to point to the strength and the weight in policymaking of this military-industrial complex and the moneyed interests that attend to, whether it's the French defense industry or the U.S. or look at this. All we have to look at is this new AUKUS agreement to see the weight of the defense industry in dictating the geopolitical diplomatic games across the Atlantic. But I think, on a more hopeful note, related to the incredible work that you two have been doing, I think part of it is about information and education. And one of the main disconnects on foreign policy, that people do not know the things that are being done in their name. They do not know the humanitarian consequences of some of these policies, insofar as, to relate, Mick, what you said at the outset, sanctions are invisible and no less a weapon of war. And so I think that, what's going to be so critical about this Novo Banco case, what I think is so exciting, and one of the reasons why it's been such fertile ground for our collaboration between the work you're doing in European Parliament and this Progressive International, is because it really shows that even in the most clear-cut cases, there is still this refusal to respond to the demands of international law and to the needs of peoples around the world on behalf of a foreign policy that so few people know about, so few people had a chance to weigh in on, and so few people would certainly agree with were they given the opportunity to deliberate. So I guess turning to that more hopeful question, how do you think that we can turn the tide on these questions of sanctions? How can we create a bigger tented coalition of people, both at the parliamentary level and at the mass base level, of people saying, you know what, A, not in my name, but B, these things, they don't work in the way that our politicians want us to think they work. They don't turn the screws on a regime to make them behave better. They end up most often punishing the very people that they claim to want to protect in the process. So how might we go about, in that more constructive sense, expanding that group of informed, that group of engaged citizens who can really try to lead a movement to transform our foreign policy in a more humane and legal direction?
Yeah, listen, I mean, your point about information is very important. And you're right in that the people are not well informed about what's really happening. I mean, people who support US sanctions still go on endlessly about the importance of human rights, the importance of international law. The truth is that sanctions are a breach of the UN Charter. Read the UN Charter. Sanctions are illegal unless they're passed by the Council, right? The UN Council, right? And there's practically none of the present sanctions that the Americans have been passed by the UN Council, right? So they're not legal. And international law is being ignored, not just by the Americans. The Americans have been ignoring international law for a long, long time. And they've had shown very little respect for it for the last 100 years, but particularly since the end of the Second World War. But the European Union now has sadly joined up with them in getting a likeness for using sanctions more. But in actual fact, instead of talking about international law now and talking about the UN Charter, you'll never hear them mention the UN Charter anymore because they know they're in breach of it. They talk now about rules-based order, right? Right, what rules-based order? Whose rules? What order, right? Is there support for the Saudi and UAE genocide in Yemen? Is there military support for that, technical support for that? The arming of the Saudis and UAE by several EU member states, is that their idea of rules-based order? They criticize the Chinese for not keeping international law. I mean, give us a break. The Chinese have bombed nobody in 40 years. The Americans have bombed someone every week for the last 40 years. I mean, they're literally trying to move the goalposts. And they're confusing information in the hope that people will just kind of turn off and ignore the realities. We need to bring the realities to the people. We need to voice our concerns more about the fact that we're actually killing people with sanctions. And the EU members who are so interested in human rights are ignoring the fact and pretending that the sanctions are not killing people. The sanctions in Syria today are an absolute, total, they're a form of terrorism. And there is no justification for it. It's all geopolitical. It is. I mean, how come did they talk about Saudi Arabia arms jihadists? Now, I mean, in some way, you can understand why we don't sanction Saudi Arabia for doing it, given that we've actually done it ourselves in Syria. And we're also doing it in Yemen. The EU and the US have actually armed Al-Qaeda in Syria and Yemen, right? So, I mean, the idea that we will actually hold others to account in the area for doing the same is actually challenging. And they're not prepared to go to that space. But sadly, the mainstream media are not going to tell the people about what's really happening. And that is a big challenge for us. And programs like your own is obviously part of addressing that. But obviously, we need a lot more support in doing it.
I think one of the things is like where the education and the information comes from. In many instances, the voice of the victims of the sanctions has to be more put center stage, because this myth that you can have painless sanctions is still out there. It's a narrative we would hear a lot in the Parliament. Oh, sure, they're just targeted against the bad guys, like, you know, no one's suffering. But it's to get that message out that people are suffering. But it's it's to fight for the restoration of international law that has been completely debased now and abandoned. And now it's not even just about sanctions. It's about some, as Mick called it in Venezuela, an unelected gobshite can come along and the international community says, do you know what? That's actually the president. And we're going to give over the wealth belonged to that nation, or huge chunks of it, to this private individual. That's all it needs. You don't need, and that banks would say, okay, take this money. And that's why I think the letter is important, that we're targeting this in such a focused way as a first step to expose the international theft that's going on here. And it's part of that overall fight.
Well, I want to thank you, Mick. I want to thank you, Clare, for leading on this letter, for drawing my attention, for drawing this audience's attention towards this critical case of humanitarian abdication by not only the Portuguese bank Novo Banco, not only by their majority shareholders Lone Star, but by European authorities who refuse to take action to ensure the safe passage of those payments to the Pan American Health Organization. I hope you'll all check out Mick and Clare and many others' letter that you can find on our website, and that you get involved with our work to raise awareness and fight against this brutal, if invisible, policy of economic sanctions, because indeed, as the title of the show's today suggests, sanctions do kill. So Mick, Clare, thank you very much. And I hope you come back to be on the show again very soon.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for the collaboration, David.
Thanks for your support. Thank you.